the government isn't inherently stupid, it just doesn't get the same signals. Explain that.
There are sort of two reasons for minimal government. One's a liberty argument, that the more you give up of your wealth and your earnings, the less liberty you have, and so you want to minimize government size. But you also want to minimize government size because of efficiency. As Friedman said, nobody spends someone else's money as wisely as they spend their own. And I think that's what that gets at the heart of as far as inherent stupidity. It's just that they're just not getting the signal that a private business person gets as far as trying to maximize a profit. And I'm actually in favor of trying to put some of that back into government to try to make government more efficient. And I would actually pay government officials on how much savings they find in their department.
So you'd suggest bonuses based on savings instead of ever increasing salaries based on the size of your department?
Exactly. And the incentive is now, when there's money left in your department, if you have a governmental department, is to spend it all so you get it next year.
For almost 7 decades, year in, year out, under presidents of both parties, under Congresses of both parties, the federal welfare leviathan has continued to grow and grow and grow. Ronald Reagan held back the growth in spending, but even he wasn't able to cut it. Why? What's the political dynamic?
Well, even welfare reform affected maybe 4 programs out of 70 or 80 programs, so it wasn't complete enough. I put it in more personal terms, and I think this is something that can appeal to people across both parties and independents as well, is that if you look like me and you hop out of your truck, you ought to be working. And I think most people believe that. We're now registering, though, more people as disabled than we are employing people, and that's a real problem. But it's a gradual problem. Republicans and Democrats have been complicit in this, but it's growing, 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 and people worry that such a great deal of dependency will ultimately drag us down as a country. And that's where the burden of debt comes in, and I think there really is a burden. But our message is a more difficult one. We need to explain to those who are working class and trying to get ahead that this burden of big government, that all of this stuff that government's offering you really has unintended consequences of dragging the economy down, dragging job creation down.
Gay marriage, Senator Rand Paul, quote, "I believe in the historical definition of marriage. That being said, I'm not for limiting contracts between adults," close quote.
That sounds like me.
It's you. There's a reason it sounds like you.
Yeah, and I think that it's the same issue, and I think some people get confused. I stand with the founding fathers on this. Jefferson, Franklin, nobody ever talks about them in marriage. Marriage was always a state issue in their day, and that's the way it was written. We didn't write a lot of things like that into the federal Constitution. In fact, not only issues like that, which don't really involve crime, but issues of crime were all state issues. They didn't really conceive of. There were about 4 different things that were federal crimes under the Constitution, and nobody really conceived of all these things. Now, anytime there's a terrible tragedy, it's got to be a federal law instead of, well, why don't you go to your state legislature, because that's maybe more appropriately where this should be handled. Every kid should know, and it should be taught in every school, is that there are 2 groups of people in our country: those who have kids when they're not married and those who don't. And if you look at the 2 lines, these are the ones in middle class and achieving well. The ones in poverty are those who are having kids, sometimes 5, 6 kids without being married. I can't make a law to tell you to get married or your kids to get married. So it really is the idea that really something bigger has to happen. This is what I say in the churches all the time when I speak in churches, is that don't look towards your politicians for all the answers. Look to your spiritual leaders. Look to this country needs a revival and a cultural reformation, but it's not going to come from government or a law.
So this is one thing I wanted to draw out because again, my understanding of libertarians is pretty heavily conditioned by Northern California. If the breakdown of the family produces a demand for big government, it certainly produces Democratic voters. We know single mothers, kids who are upset, young adults who've been raised in broken homes, old elderly people who are living in isolation because they no longer have family support. Those are folks who tend to vote Democratic.
Right.
If you care about small government, there's almost a requirement to care about supporting the family, isn't there?
Well, I think so.
And you do draw that connection explicitly.
And there are different ways to look at it, because there's one, which is a moral and religious argument for the family and for the traditions of it.
And you buy that. Libertarian though you are, you buy the moral argument.
Yeah, but there's also an argument that completely beyond religion. If you're an agnostic libertarian and you say, keep the government out of my family structure, I would also say that why don't we simply teach that there's an economic argument for this, that poverty is associated with having kids before you're married, and the family structure helps to keep you out of poverty. And it's not a perfect society. And I think the danger in saying things like this is people say, well, I had my kids before I was married, and look, I'm doing fine, or I'm not a bad person, or I'm divorced. So it really isn't directed towards the individual, but when you look at the statistics, it is an enormous cultural problem. And this is an argument, it's not just say no. This is sort of an argument for birth control. It's an argument for planning your family and planning, when you have it.
Iraq, was it a mistake to go in the first place?
Yes.
It was in the first place. Okay.
Not with Afghanistan. I was supportive of going into Afghanistan, but even Afghanistan now, the mission's been lost, and we've gotten bin Laden, we've disrupted the Taliban, and after 10 years, if we haven't trained the Afghan army, we're not going to. But I would say there's a good analogy in Afghanistan as to why Syria is such a mistake. After 10 years of being in Afghanistan, it's a fairly stable, it's like we can pick people to be in the military on the Afghan side and we train them. We still can't figure out friend from foe. Many people join the Afghan army and they just lie. They say, oh yes, we were supportive of Americans, and when the American soldier turns, they shoot him in the back. That's happened 100 times. Imagine how much more difficult it's going to be in Syria when you're handing out Stinger missiles and man-pads and all of this sophisticated weapons to decide who's friend and who's foe.
Okay, so let me ask about Pakistan, say. We've got the drone program going on. They're killing bad guys. There's collateral damage, horrible phrase for meaning deaths to civilians. Right. That requires, as I understand it, that requires a presence on the ground to develop our own intelligence separate from what the Pakistanis tell us. And the notion would be that that's pretty directly related to the defense of this republic. We're not trying to engage in nation building in Pakistan. So you'd support the drone program?
I think that within and throughout the world, on-the-ground intelligence is something that we do have to spend money on and that we do need to be concerned with. And that means Arabic speakers in our military as well as our State Department and people living in those countries and knowing about it. Pakistan's probably one of the most worrisome places in the world. There's a significant amount of hatred for America there. But I don't see giving $2 billion a year directly to the Pakistan government. They're imprisoning really the best informant we ever had, maybe, or one of the betters, Shakil Afridi, who helped us get information on bin Laden. We're not going to get much more information from informants if we don't protect our informants. And I think it's been a mistake that we continue to give money to Pakistan despite them imprisoning him for the rest of his life. With regard to the drone program, there's definitely a usefulness for drones within combat and within the military. Anything that can save our soldiers' lives, I'm for. Killing non-combatants, American citizens, I think they should be tried for treason. It's a very rare occurrence. We've only targeted one, and I think he should have just been tried for treason. Then maybe you target him, but really there should have been a court. I don't like a politician deciding guilt of an American. Next time you're in France, I don't like them just deciding to, waylay you with a drone as opposed to having some kind of court decide that you're a traitor. With regard to foreigners, I think there is a time, bin Laden, I think, deserved what he got, and he should have, whether it was with a drone or with individual soldiers. And so there are some leaders of these terrorists that I think should be killed. But once you've knocked off the top leadership, and then you knock off the next leadership and the next leadership, is there ever an end? And is there a point in time at which it becomes sort of a recruiting tool and a negative thing for America? And I think there is a point in time. There's also a point in time when you antagonize the host country to a degree that they're no longer interested in. And I think that's where we are with Pakistan. The war's gone on too long. People are ready for that war to be over, and so am I. It doesn't mean that we withdraw from the world, but it does mean that the time has come for the war to end in Afghanistan.
It would be a misunderstanding of Rand Paul to say, oh, he just wants to bring everybody home. You actually call for a Pentagon, a defense establishment that remains more powerful and better funded than the next X number of countries put together, correct?
Right. There's 14 countries combined. The next 14 countries combined equal our budget. Now, I'm not saying there's not room for savings within our budget. I am for auditing the Pentagon. I am for cutting costs in the Pentagon. But what I would say is that if you're willing to cut in other parts of the budget significantly, that defense is one of our priorities. Defense is what the federal government should be doing. It is constitutional. And I'm willing to do that and willing to make it a priority. But I'm not willing to say, oh, let's throw out the sequester just to feed the military-industrial complex. I'm saying you have to keep the sequester if you're not willing to cut significantly in other places.